geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comic book fans from all over the world. It's your old pal, Chuck Dixon. And but your old pal is a little busy this week, so I won't be able to prepare a brand new show for you. So I'm instituting the inaugural premiere, first time ever clip show. Now, I know what you're saying to yourself, Chuck. Are you going to make us watch or listen to crap you've already told us or shown us? You can't do that to us. We're your loyal fans. Why would you screw us over? Well, I'm not, because you haven't seen these clips before, because these are clips that of videos I made for Unauthorized TV. This is their first time appearing on YouTube, and for many, many of you who don't subscribe to Unauthorized TV, this be your first time seeing them. I hope you enjoy. Hey everybody, it's Chuck Dixon back once again to talk to you about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. And this is another video that is exclusive to Unauthorized TV. So if you're a supporter of Unauthorized TV, thank you. It is very much appreciated. Just my fan here. It's a little hot in the studio today. Studio, it's my office. Same place I write stories. I broadcast to you, America, and the world. Anyway, so want to get a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. It relates to writing, but it relates to bigger things as well. I read a really interesting book recently, and it's called "Where Is My Flying Car?" by J. Storrs Hall. J. Storrs Hall is an engineer. Very much into nanotechnology and things like that. And he wrote this fascinating book about the promise of the future, or I should say the overpromise of the future. Why aren't we more in the future than we are now? It seems like there's been amazing technological advancements, but they've all kind of been in one area. Not really affecting our day-to-day physical lives. The metaverse is not going to necessarily improve our lives, make us live any longer, or make everything more convenient. It seems like every big technological advancement these days is a distraction. It's either entertainment or communication or information. Nothing has really changed in the world. And yet we were promised the future was going to be very, very different. Hence the title, "Where Is My Flying Car?" And he deals quite a bit with flying cars in the book, but it's kind of a leitmotif. It's kind of just a theme he returns to over and over again. The book is extraordinarily well written. And he returns to the flying car because it's the most common trope. If you ask people, what were you expecting the future to be like? Inevitably, the flying car comes up. And why don't I have one? In the past, we were promised this bright, wonderful future that science and technology was going to bring us, and it really hasn't happened. There hasn't been any real technological or engineering changes in the last 50 years, other than the expansion of the internet, the ability for computers to remember more. It really isn't a change, is it? It's an improvement. Computers could remember stuff in the 60s. Now they can just remember more. But, basically they haven't changed. And yes, they're more user-friendly. And all of these advances, remember, came from the private sector. The government may have been instrumental through DARPA and other agencies in creating the internet, but it's through private funding that we have most of the technological changes we've seen in the last 30 or so years. The government wasn't involved in them. In fact, the government did everything they could to slow it down. And that's another theme in this book. Now, in the past, we were promised all these crazy, wacky inventions by science fiction writers, and how it was going to be a different world that we lived in. It was just going to be this amazing technological utopia where anything was possible, and everyone's lives would be improved, our longevity, our health, and we were all going to be put on an equal footing, all lifted up by our bootstraps, possibly by a robot sometime in the future. But so many of these things didn't happen And there's a number of reasons why, which I'll get into later on. But the author brings up the thorium reactor. Now, remember, I'm not a science guy by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a high school educated guy with some college, and that some college was at a community college, so we all know what that was worth. So in other words, I went to 13th grade. I'm a guy who I didn't want to take chemistry and physics because I knew I wouldn't understand any of it. So in high school, I took agriculture as my science major, which I still insist has been more helpful to me today, because it's a science you can apply in your everyday life. I learned a lot taking agriculture, and that is something I understand. I understand the application of science in our lives. And, it's kind of part of being a writer, especially if you write science fiction, which I've written some science fiction, where you take the existing application of current science and you extrapolate, try to imagine what the future will be like. And one of the things this author talks about in the book is the thorium reactor. It's a thorium molten salt reactor. It's a nuclear reactor. Instead of having a nuclear reactor relying on uranium to provide the fissionable material, he said that he writes that in the 1960s they experimented with a thorium reactor, which is far safer, doesn't need as much monitoring, can be made smaller, so that you could have local nuclear reactors in your neighborhood that wouldn't necessarily need to be monitored 24/7, because the dangers of a meltdown, if a meltdown were to happen, were minimal with thorium, because it simply isn't as dangerous to your health, anywhere near as dangerous to your health as uranium, and it can be dealt with. It can be depleted just simply using water. And there's virtually no nuclear waste involved with a thorium reactor plant. But experimentation with it, they built some working ones, and apparently there are some people experimenting with them today. But all government funding in the United States was called off by Richard Nixon because a thorium plant doesn't produce any byproducts that would be useful in nuclear weapons. And we were in the middle of an arms race with the Russians. So nuclear reactors, atomic energy plants were seen as a twofer. Not only were they providing cheap electricity, they were also providing us with the weapons grade or potentially weapons grade plutonium we needed to make our nuclear weapons possible. So the thorium reactor kind of went the way of the dinosaurs. And then, of course, all the fear inspired over anything nuclear in the 70s kind of killed any kind of research into nuclear energy as an alternative energy source. So you can't get a grant, you can't get government money, you can't get anybody interested in helping you research safer, I was going to say cleaner nuclear energy, but nuclear energy is pretty clean. I'm saying this I'm not a nuclear energy advocate. I think the uranium plants, the standard, fission generator of the 50s, 60s, they have a pretty good track record, other than the famous ones we can point to, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and Chernobyl. The problem is that they're safe, they're clean, unless something happens. And when something happens, it tends to be really horrible and catastrophic, not only in terms of loss of human life, danger from radiation, but financially. When one of these places goes bad, it goes bad, and it's got to be sealed up and never used again. And that's billions of dollars down the drain. Plus you add in all the regulation and everything else, and it just makes the current technology for creating a nuclear plant prohibitive. But that's what this guy gets into. Why all these things? Here we had a future. We had a future that the bureaucracy and leftist politics took away from us. So we're back to, coal, natural gas, and diesel, and with no real alternative energy. Nanotechnology is another one. The theories of nanotechnology came up in the 1960s and were immediately poo-pooed by the eggheads at the major universities, so no funding could be started. Nanotechnology reared its head in the 70s And 80s, again, was poo-pooed, shut down, declared impossible. And it wasn't until the 1990s a resurgence of interest in it, and continues to this day, but primarily privately funded. I don't even pretend to understand what nanotechnology is, but the stuff that they say that they can do is rather amazing. And it's like, wow, I can't believe any of that stuff's possible. But of course, I've said that a number of times in my life and been proven wrong. So is it worth looking into? Of course. If we could manipulate molecules, if we can manipulate matter on a molecular level and create machines that could build other machines, that could build other machines, that could build other machines, till it's scaled down to where we have machines that can do this work, I think that's worth looking into, don't you? Another failed technology was the beta battery. Come up in the 60s. It was powered by beta radiation. Beta radiation is so weak it can't pass through a sheet of typing paper. But again, it was shut down because of fear. And a beta battery in your cell phone would basically charge your cell phone for the rest of your life. You would never have to charge it. A beta battery in a Tesla would give that Tesla a 6,000-mile range rather than the 300-mile range that it gets from a 24-hour charge. So you could drive your Tesla for years, or a year, or 6 months without ever recharging it, and then recharge it in 24 hours and drive for another 6 months to a year. Now, there's a lot of reasons why these technologies died in the crib, and many other technologies. Some technologies that we enjoy today were shut down, were delayed rather than shut down. We could have had them, but there's always fear of new things. In the 1800s, it was the Luddites who feared that their jobs would be taken away by machines, and so they destroyed them. More recently, from 1972 on, you've got the environmentalists, and they don't like anything, and they really hate energy. They hate any kind of energy. They're afraid of any kind of energy. If it's especially any kind of energy that wasn't their idea. They don't like natural gas or fracking or nuclear or diesel or the internal combustion engine. They don't like any of these things, and they don't understand any of them either. In fact, the environmentalists, and they've come out and stated this, that cheap or nearly free energy sources available to everyone in the world would be too dangerous, that we would be irresponsible with it. I mean, what does that mean? I'll leave the TV on all night? I mean, I don't get that. That it would be too dangerous in the hands of the common man to have unlimited electricity. Now, electricity, even more so than food, because we've solved most of the food problems, electricity and energy are what leave a large percentage of the world's population in poverty. If they had actual power, they could do all the things that we do, like wash their clothes without labor, farming, all the things that we take for granted. And I think that's why the environmentalists hate them, because they don't understand how they've improved the environmentalist life. I mean, they drive to the protest in their Prius and kind of forget how they got there. That they kind of owe Henry Ford for that. We're all living in this very, very comfortable world that our grandparents and great-grandparents would be astounded at. We've got all this free time in order to turn around and hate on the very things that got us here. The other enemy, of course, is bureaucrats, is the government. The government doesn't seem to like any kind of science. They certainly don't understand science. I read a number of years ago that the average member of Congress, their understanding of science is at a 5th grade level. Now that's the average. That means there's a number of people in Congress and the Senate, and I think we all know who they are, who have an understanding that's lower than a 5th grader. So it's and of course they don't like anything that either doesn't line their pockets or they can't put their name on it. So they tend to fund all the wrong things. When nanotechnology came back in vogue in the 90s, a number of scientists who were already begging the government for grants realized that they were in danger of losing them if this nanotech thing caught on. And so they simply added the word nanotech to their already existing requests for money. And the government doled out $3 billion to them, even though they weren't actually working on anything related to nanotech. But the morons who hand out the money in Washington, they don't know that. And so billions were spent by the government with no results in the area of nanotechnology. And that's how this thing works. It's a bunch of deadheads with the cash, our cash, handing it out to people who have no intention of doing the work in the first place. Mostly they're just guarding their corner. They're just making sure that their theories or their viewpoint on science isn't challenged or changed. Cue Dr. Fauci. Mostly we don't see any technological advancements because of fear. As I said, fear of energy, fear for the environment, fear of the change, that would come about if there were robots in our lives. And this is different than in the past when new technologies came along. They would promise that it would improve our lives. Owning an automobile made your life easier. Owning a washing machine, owning a refrigerator. The telegraph was going to end war. The telephone would make it so that we could stay in touch with loved ones. Now every proposed technology means that the robots are going to take over the world, even as Apple and Google and Facebook and the rest are literally doing that. And a lot of people, a lot of scientists inside the game are gaming the system here. During Prohibition, a number of bootleggers came out in support of stricter prohibition laws. Why? Because stricter prohibition laws increased their margins and increased the demand for their product. So they were playing both sides against the middle. And if, according to this book, Where is My Flying Car?, there's a number of people, influential people in the scientific community who do much the same thing. They act as if they're against a certain area of technology in order to protect their own area. In other words, to make sure their advancements they propose, their theories, their studies, their grant money doesn't go anywhere near someone who actually might make a difference. The sharpest example presented in the book was the Wright brothers. Now, the Wright brothers undeniably flew the first heavier-than-air vehicle. We owe everything in aviation to this initial advancement. And yet for years and years and years, a guy called Samuel Langley was credited with flying the world's first aeroplane. And when the Wright brothers in 1910, 7 years after the flight of Kitty Hawk, went to the Smithsonian to basically give them their original plane to put on display, the Smithsonian said, no, we don't want it because you weren't the first guys to fly an aeroplane. It was Samuel Langley. Now, what was Samuel Langley's position at that time? He was the director of the Smithsonian. See how that works? Now, Langley did do some experimentation in aviation, but was never able to get a plane off the ground on his own. It wasn't until he sold his patents and his specs to a guy named Curtiss that Curtiss finally made improvements to his aeroplane and got it off the ground. But it wasn't Langley. But see, Langley was guarding his corner. He wanted to be known as the first guy to fly a heavier-than-air vehicle. And it wasn't until the Wright brothers offered their original airplane to an institute in London that they were finally recognized as the first airplane heavier-than-air vehicle pioneers. But if not for that, we would be saying that Langley, because of his position, appointed position, political position, as director of the Smithsonian, would have been credited. See how that works? It's very, very corrupt. And that's what we've got going on. We've got all these highly educated people with all these degrees and nothing to show for it. They're not making any advancements. They're basically in lockstep learning the same science that's been taught for the last 50 years and doing what everyone does in education, just parroting back what their instructors and textbooks have told them and getting that credential that gets them out in the world. Now, once upon a time, France and Germany, this is during the Industrial Revolution, they spent a lot of money on advanced technology. They thought, oh, this Industrial Revolution, this is a great thing. So the French and German governments allocated, what would today be billions of dollars into technological research, into scientific research, to basically become the lords of the Industrial Revolution. Well, it didn't happen because the money just sunk into the bureaucracy. It was given to people who weren't necessarily talented at science, but were really talented at pitching for grants, for pitching for tax dollars. Now, where the science was happening in the Industrial Revolution was in Great Britain and the United States, where no government money was spent. It was all private cash. It was all people putting up their own capital, doing their own experimentation, and reaping the rewards from these amazing machines that they were building, up to and including the internal combustion engine. They were revolutionizing the world. Electricity, telegraphy, the telephone. All of this was happening in Great Britain and in the United States because the government wasn't involved. There was no regulatory body telling them what to do and how to do whatever. Now, what happens when the government does get involved? We end up with failed technologies. The wind turbine is frankly ridiculous, and yet we continue to pour billions of dollars into this useless, inefficient, super expensive, quote-unquote, alternative energy, because no one ever listened to any real scientist about it. They just decided on a course, and they went there. Now, the one area of technology this book does say is probably far in the future is artificial intelligence, the robot who will do whatever you want at any time. And he used the example from Steve Wozniak of Apple, who said that, AI, the actual computer, the thinking, sentient machine, will not be possible until we come to the day when a robot can show up at anybody's house, be invited in, and then make the inhabitants of the house coffee. In other words, they would have to go into a strange kitchen, use a machine they've never used before or a device they've never used before, and know where the coffee was or figure out where the coffee was, things that a 10-year-old can do. No robot can do. They go, well, they can teach a robot to play chess, but to teach a robot to play Go was a computation nightmare on an order of magnitudes because Go is so much more complicated than chess. And going into a stranger's house and knowing how to make coffee in a kitchen they've never been in before, it seems like at this point in the science an almost impossible computing goal. So it's a high hurdle to jump for AI. And one of the reasons I know that AI isn't working, outfits like Amazon put billions of dollars into AI. Amazon ostensibly is not a company about delivering you books or gewgaws. It is a company interested in AI. They want to know all about you. They want to be a knowledge company. They want to be there with what you need before you need it. But despite all the billions of dollars they spend, I still get suggestions from them for products that I might like, and they're wrong 99% of the time. In fact, statistically, Amazon's predictive ideas of what their customers might like are wrong 80% of the time. That's a terrible average. That's a terrible average. A 3-year-old would be able to get you what you want from another room with a greater accuracy than Amazon can suggest a book you might like based on information they already have. Now you look at this. I'm not in the least bit interested in any of these products that are on my Amazon suggested for you list. And yet they have years and years and years of literally thousands of items that I have bought. And they can't figure out what I want So their AI, it's pretty damn dumb. Now the guy, he gives credit where credit is due to science fiction writers, and over the years, Heinlein, A.E. Van Vogt, of course Arthur C. Clarke, guys like that, who were pretty dead on accurate. Not necessarily when these things might happen, and sometimes they were. Clarke was amazing at when these things might happen, but what might happen in the future and predicting all these different things. And it's great that he credits these science fiction authors, but a guy he didn't credit, a guy who was dead on accurate on a technology that all of us use every day, that was utterly unanticipated by anybody in the past, was Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby, the comic book artist and comic book writer, comic book creator, basically the father of Marvel Comics, creating Fantastic Four, Hulk, Captain America, and all these other tremendous characters. When he went to DC Comics, he did a series. He moved from Marvel to DC in the 70s. Did a series called his Fourth World books, The New Gods, Forever People, and Mr. Miracle. And in this epic about two worlds, one good, one evil, huge cosmic saga, he created something called the Mother Box. And the Mother Box was a communication system that was available to everybody on both planets. Both planets had the same exact technology, a shared technology between the good guys and the bad guys. And the Mother Box was it was the internet. It was a communication system, and the neatest thing about it was it could be personalized. And your Mother Box became a big part of your life in the Fourth World. And all the heroes and villains had one. And their Mother Box knew them, and it was personalized to them, and they would talk to it, and it would talk back, and it had all the information that they would possibly want to put their hands on. And one of my favorite scenes in all of comics is when Orion, who's one of the new gods, he destroys the Mother Box of this bad guy called Slig. And Slig's like this scaly monster critter, but he has a Mother Box. And Orion destroys it. And Orion is a hero who's got a nasty streak. And he's kind of overjoyed that he destroyed Slig's Mother Box. That Slig's Mother Box chose to die. And then he rubs it in by saying, "She loved you, Slig," and laughing at him. Because all of the denizens of the Fourth World, the denizens of New Genesis and of Apocalypse, had a deep personal relationship with their Mother Box. They were simply lost without one. They had come to rely on this little device, this little handheld device, that they could attach to their belt or put in a pocket. And it became so much a part of their lives that they had an actual emotional bond with this device. And I guess this all sounds familiar, doesn't it? And Kirby predicted it. He even predicted the approximate size of the thing. And I just find that astounding. And I wish that, I understand the author wasn't a comics fan, so he's probably just not aware of this. But I feel like I should write to him and make him aware, because Kirby's predictions for the Mother Box were so on the money. We're living in the world that Kirby predicted. So, hey, if you want to contact me with suggestions, comments, whatever, you want to send me a picture of your dog, I'd love to look at it. Funny cat videos, whatever you got, you can contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com, brunobookstore@gmail.com. It is the most reliable way of getting a hold of me. So until next time, I want to thank all of you for showing up and, taking some time to listen, to watch. And I guess I'll see all of you down the road. Hey, it's your old pal Chuck Dixon, back to talk to you about just writing in general. I talked earlier in a video about collecting stories and weird bits of trivia, the kind of stuff that you need as a writer to enrich your stories, to make them different, to make them unique. And recently read an extended interview with writer-director John Milius. Uh, if you're not familiar with Milius's name, you're certainly familiar with his work. For comic book fans, he's probably most famous for having written and directed the first Conan movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. But he's, a legendary screenwriter and director. He wrote the screenplay for Apocalypse Now. If you ever get a chance to read his original screenplay, it is a gas. It's much better than the finished product. It holds together better than Coppola's vision of it. But everything in Apocalypse Now was Milius's idea. Um, the movie is a great movie because it's based on a great screenplay. Um, he also wrote and directed any number of films, from Dillinger to Wind and the Lion to my favorite of his, Farewell to the King. Now, in the interview, he touches on a lot of things about writing, directing, storytelling, and the like. And the guy's had a tremendous track record. Um, he saved an awful lot of movies and script doctoring and rewrites. So the guy knows what he's talking about. And the interviewer asked him why so many Hollywood movies are so crappy these days. And the interview happened, I believe it was 2001. And movies were starting to really become crappy then. You still had a few good movies made, unlike today, where a good movie is few and far between. Really good movies are extremely rare these days. And Milius gives an answer that kind of explains a lot of it. He said that so many filmmakers didn't have any real life experience to draw on. They drew on movies they'd seen, and there really wasn't. They hadn't lived rich lives or varied lives. He said that's why so many movies were based or were set in high school or college, because that was the filmmaker's last experience mixing with people unlike themselves. So the last time they were in a mixed social group and there were stakes, there was still a possibility of failure. There was still some real drama in their life. And he said that's the reason why so many movies were boring, so many movies were bad, so many movies lacked any kind of heart, because the people making them had vapid lives. And he talked about how you had to gather stories from everywhere. He said even in comedy movies, you see the same jokes over and over again, the same gag lines and punchlines over and over and over again, because these people are just drawing on movies that came before, or a sort of limited zeitgeist amongst the Hollywood elite. And he gave an example of how he was somewhere out in the Midwest, and he was hanging out with farmers. People as far from his profession as it is possible to imagine. And one of the farmers told him a story involving a grizzly bear, that some visitor came up and wanted to see a grizzly bear, and this guy said, I'll go get you one, and when you're done with that one, I'll bring you another. Well, this story stuck in Milius's head. He liked the story. And he said, this is a story you would never hear anywhere else, but from this guy. Okay. It wasn't published anywhere or anything else. You had to be sitting with this guy, at the local restaurant and hear this story. And he ended up including it in the movie Jeremiah Johnson. If you've never seen the movie, Jeremiah Johnson, played by Robert Redford, encounters Will Geer, a much more experienced mountain man up in the foothills of the Rockies. And when the mountain man asks Jeremiah Johnson, do you know how to skin a bear? Jeremiah Johnson admits that he does. And so the mountain man runs a grizzly bear into Jeremiah Johnson's tent. and says, when you're done with that one, I'll bring you another. So you can see where, Milius drew that from real life. He drew that from someone he met casually, and someone he would not have met on Rodeo Drive or in a Beverly Hills mansion. And that was the point he was making, that you not only have to meet lots of people and experience lots of things, uh, but you have to remember them. You have to recall them. You have to keep them in the back of your mind for later use, because that's what writers do. You remember those moments. Now, I've had a few in my life. I haven't led a wild and crazy life, but I've met a lot of people, and a lot of different kind of people, and I've always enjoyed talking to them. Years and years ago, I used to do a lot of Appalachian trail hiking, mostly through Pennsylvania, quite a bit in Maine. Um, it's a great place to go to clear your head. And this was, I guess, early to mid 80s. I was by myself hiking on the trail, and I went to a shelter I was familiar with that I had stayed at before. And these shelters are dotted along the trail. If you don't know about the trail, it runs from Georgia to Maine, and it was built during the Depression. It was like a busy work project of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it was basically to keep unemployed men busy so they didn't get into trouble. And he sent them up in the woods and had them hack this trail all along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, from the bottom of the East Coast to the top. Anyway, these shelters are there, and this is pretty typical. Three-sided, open in the front. You can get up off the ground and lay your sleeping bag in there. It's a little warmer. It's certainly a lot drier. So anyway, I headed up to one of these, and I was going to spend a couple of days just reading and kicking around and hiking around the general area. And as usual, you run into strangers. You run into other people on the trail who are heading for that shelter as well. Now, this was in the fall. It was getting a little cold out, so there weren't a lot of people. But two guys showed up, and it was like dusk. And two guys showed up, and I was already set up. And they joined me at my campfire, literally. And it turned out it was a guy, older guy, and his son-in-law. And they were, spending the weekend, doing about 50 miles on the trail. That was cool. So we're sitting around the fire, and we're, hey, what guys do. What do you do? What do you do for a living? What's your story? And the younger guy, the son-in-law, he had this awesome coffee mug. It was a steel coffee mug, but it was thick-walled coffee mug with a chain in the handle. A chain was made into the handle so you could hang it. And I said, man, this coffee cup is incredible. Where did you get this? And he says, I got it in prison. Well, now I'm like, okay, I'm miles and miles and miles away from anywhere. It's dark out. We are the only three people here. Am I going to end up in a shallow grave behind this shelter? Who do I run into but a guy who's been in prison and brought out his coffee mug with him? And him and the older guy, they laugh, and the younger guy reveals, I wasn't in prison. I drive a Stroman bread truck. Stroman's a Philadelphia-based bread company. And he goes, I was delivering a load of bread to a prison, and a guy yelled out the bars of the windows. He's like 2 stories up, and he's yelling out through the bars, throw me up a loaf of bread. It's a convict. He wants a free loaf of bread. Throw me up a loaf of bread. And this guy says, well, what do you trade me for it? And sailing out between the bars is this coffee mug this guy had. That's how he got it. And yeah, he tossed a loaf of bread up to the guy. He made a fair trade. He kept his promise. Now, the older guy, turned out he was a retired Philadelphia city engineer, and he had a lot of fascinating stories about engineering in Philadelphia, a lot of inside dope that I've squirreled away in my head over all these years. And, really interesting stuff. But the most fascinating story he told was he was in the Navy in 1945, United States Navy. And, he'd gone all through World War II. And he was with the fleet in Tokyo Harbor in May 1945 when the Japanese had, said, okay, we've had enough. The second A-bomb had dropped and the Japanese sued for peace, as they say, unconditional surrender. And this guy was telling me that, the whole fleet's there. They've got nothing to do. They're just sitting in the bay, anchored. And him and a few of his buddies managed to get drunk. God knows what. So they got drunk and they took a launch, a small little whaleboat, and they had stolen crates of oranges from the mess and from the galley. And they were going around the fleet trying to sell them. So they're tooling around in their little boat, going up to destroyers and aircraft carriers and battleships, and they're yelling up, hey, you want some oranges? Trying to sell their oranges. Well, they come up on this battleship, and the guy tells me it's all hung with flags and bunting and banners. It's all decorated. It's a big old battleship. And there's a wooden pier that's been built with a gangway leading up to the main deck. And it's all decorated with, stars and stripes. So they pull up to this thing and they slam into it. They slam into it, make this big noise as this wooden dock, floating wooden dock, hammers into the hull of the battleship. And an officer looks over the the gunwale of the ship, the railing down at them, and says, what the hell are you guys doing? And they're drunk off their ass, and they're going, hey, you want to buy some oranges? We got oranges. And the officer says, get the hell away from this ship, get out of here, or you guys are in a lot of trouble. You're going to spend the rest of your lives in the brig unless you get away from this battleship right now. So they went away. Oh, he doesn't want any oranges. The guy said what he learned later when he sobered up was that battleship was the USS Missouri, and they were preparing for the arrival of the Japanese emperor to surrender. Now, where else are you going to hear that story? You're not going to read that story in the history books. You're only going to know that story if you met the guy who was there. And that's what I mean. You meet people, and they tell you this stuff, and it's unique. It's a unique experience. And I never would have run into the guy, if I wasn't out there in the middle of the night on the Appalachian Trail. Now, writers need quieter moments too, things that happen to them. Everybody's got stories they can't forget, and they're not like spectacular, amazing adventures or hair-raising or anything else, but they're these quiet moments. I remember, this is shortly after the Appalachian Trail trip. It was Christmas Eve. I lived in Pennsylvania, and we had a blizzard on Christmas Eve, and it was snowing like hell. And somebody in the family needed something. Everybody always did. There's always something they left off the shopping list just before Christmas, something for Christmas dinner or whatever. I volunteered to go out in the snow because, I had a truck with a lot of clearance and I could make it through the snow. So I head out to the local supermarket. It's coming down like crazy. And I go in, get what I need to get, push my shopping cart out to the truck and unload it. And I see this woman out on the parking lot, and she's got a big parka on, and she's like grandmother age. She's like the age I am now. This woman in her 60s. She's got this parka with the hood up, and she's gathering the shopping carts. And I realized that they sent this woman out in the middle of a howling blizzard to gather up the shopping carts on the lot. And she's pushing them back, and she's not a big woman. She's, she's an old lady, and she, instead of some teenage punk, they sent her out. And she's pushing them back toward her. And so she, I'm behind her, and she pushes, the stuff back, to the store entrance. I'm behind her, and I said, here's another one. I brought my cart back to the store. And she looks at me and she says, you're one in a million. And I always remembered that. And from that point on, I always brought my cart back to the store because she was so appreciative. This poor woman had been sent out to do a task that, was really meant for a younger man on the worst night of the year, literally. And, just that response to my, tiny, trivial act of kindness, you're one in a million, always stuck with me. But those are little quiet moments, because everything in your stories isn't about, bombast. It's not all strum and drang. It's those little moments that make a story believable and interesting. So there you go. There you go. So those are my words of wisdom shared with you from the great John Milius. And remember, ArcToons. ArcToons is out there, brand new comic book platform, digital, free, high res, fabulous, with lots and lots of new material for you to read and enjoy, and more, much, much more on the way. And, I'm getting to do some really interesting stuff, but what I need from you is a little bit of help on the cashola end. If you go to Patreon and look for Archaven, that's the Chuck Dixon Slush Fund, you can contribute, $1, $3, $5, and help me pay those starving artists so I can keep bringing you my great material on ArcToons along with all the other fantastic series, mini-series, and one-shot stories we got going on there. All right, that's it, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing. And I'll see you down the road. Hey, Chuck Dixon here to talk about something that's, come up recently in the news. It's an old story that just won't die in one version or another. And this time it leads to something a little bit personal, a little bit something I can speak to from my own life experience, or as the wokies say, lived experience. This means my own version of reality that has no bearing on anything that's actually happening in the real world. Hey, the new James Bond 007 movie, No Time to Die, is out. And as with every James Bond movie, there's a controversy. Someone gins up a controversy, two people with a newsletter or a website or a Facebook presence start, carping about some element in every James Bond movie released since the postmodern period dropped on us. From the mid-90s on, Bond is the target of anyone with any kind of a complaint, mostly because they can piggyback on this extraordinarily popular franchise to promote their own, wacky views. We've heard throughout Bond's history that he's a sexist pig, he's a racist, he's a homophobe, he smokes too much, he drinks too much, he has too much unprotected sex, he's too violent, he's too uncaring, he's probably hates the environment and strangles baby ducks. The point that these wokies miss is the fact that, Bond represents toxic masculinity at his very best. And he certainly represents imperialism. You could say he's a remnant of another age. That's fine. That's what we like about him. He's also a bit of a prick. We like that too. He's an elitist. He's a snob. But it's all part of who James Bond is. And what we like about all that is that Bond at his very best is willing to strip away that sophisticated, urbane, continental veneer to reveal the animal within as he, bests everyone he comes up against by either shooting them, hand-to-hand combat, setting them on fire, dropping them off of buildings, whatever. Bond gets the job done. He's a badass. We all love badasses. We don't judge badasses as long as they're on our side. And Bond shouldn't be judged. Now, the people that create Bond, they've tried to do everything they can to appease the crowd, the same way everyone else in the entertainment industry does. And short of making Bond a bisexual Filipino with a speech impediment, they've acquiesced to almost every demand thrown at them. I don't think Bond smokes anymore. We don't see him drink very much. He's kinder and gentler to women. He cries. He even threw his gun away in the last movie I saw. And, this new one promises to be, more of the same as they try to, feed the alligator hoping it won't eat them next. But now, this movie, as much as they tried to make peace with the far left and make peace with the activists, they still ran into a controversy. And the controversy is over the fact that the Bond villain in this film, like the Bond villain in so many films, is disfigured. He has a facial disfigurement. And they say that this is really bad for people who are disfigured. That it makes them feel bad because disfigurement is associated with being a bad person. Yeah, is it a Hollywood cliche? Is it a trope? Of course it is. Personally, I've written a lot of characters, bad guy characters, and some good guy characters, but mostly bad guy characters who have scars or are missing an eye or a nose or an ear or have half their face burn off, whatever, because it's comic books. And it's a convenient shortcut, just as it is in the movies, to say that this is a bad guy or this is a guy with issues. And maybe the scar, maybe it begins with the scar, or maybe or maybe like Al Capone, he has the scar because he's not a good person. So, going back to Richard III, and even further in literature and mythology and culture, disfigurement, having a head full of snakes, is associated with being a bad guy. And not only just a bad guy, but a dangerous person. And yeah, you can go into all the psychological stuff that the ugly exterior is a reflection of the ugliness of the person's soul, and that's why we associate with evil, whatever. But, this is movies, this is comic books. In real life, when you see a person with a facial disfigurement or deformity, you don't immediately think they have a subterranean lair full of goons and are ready to take over the world. I mean, this is ridiculous. We all understand, except the lunatics making these aspersions, we all understand the difference between fantasy and reality. That associating scars and things like that with evil is something we do in fiction. It's not in real life. I have good friends who have, who face the challenge of having a facial deformity, and they get along fine. And even closer to home, I myself was born with massive facial deformities. This is the earliest known picture of me, and trust me, it is heavily touched up. At this point, what am I, maybe 2 in this picture? At this point, I've had 5 surgeries to fix the fact that I was born without a palate. I didn't have a cleft palate. I wasn't even lucky enough to have a cleft palate. I had no palate. And I had what's commonly known as a hair lip that went all the way up to between my eyes. So I'm basically a bifurcated nose. I was a wreck. I was a horror movie ready to happen. And but I didn't end up with a subterranean lair full of goons and plotting to take over the world. How did that happen? First of all, I had a very persistent mother who would not take no for an answer. She went to doctor to doctor to doctor, and all the doctors said that nothing could be done until I was 5 or 6 years old. No surgery could be performed. There was no one who would operate on an infant. I had not left the hospital yet at this point. My mom had to leave me there because I was, in critical care, basically. Had to be fed through an eyedropper. And I was, I'm 6'3", 6'4", 260 now. And but back then I was under 6 pounds. And so no one would operate on an infant, especially an infant that tiny. So my mother wouldn't stop. She went everywhere looking for a solution because she rightfully thought, if we wait till this kid's 5 or 6 years old to repair this, his life is ruined. He's going to live with this the rest of his life. He is going to have a speech impediment. He is going to have problems because people are going to treat you odd if you look like something that came out of a horror film. So, I mean, you've seen the pictures on TV. They show Doctors Without Borders, and there's various charities that go around the third world doing, cleft palate operations for free. And you've seen the pictures. Well, mine were about as bad as you can get. And eventually, my mom did her research. This is before the internet. Long before the internet. She did her research, and she found out that at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, which we were lucky enough to live in Philadelphia, was starting up an experimental program to repair cleft palates. It's now known as the Cleft Palate Clinic. It was the leader in the science of maxillofacial surgery. Many of the techniques used today commonly were invented there by a Dr. Randall. And my mother met with Dr. Randall and took me along. And he saw me as his special project because I didn't have a cleft palate. I had no palate, plus the other maxillofacial deformities. I had a split upper jaw, all kinds of stuff. Just bad news. Thankfully, I can't remember any of this. But so she worked with the Cleft Palate Clinic. Now, my dad was working like as a sheet metal worker. He couldn't afford these kind of surgeries. So basically, they signed me away to the Cleft Palate Clinic. That they would do the surgery to create a palate for me and fix my facial deformities. And it wouldn't cost my parents a dime. But I had to basically, until I was 16, go in for regular visits to the Cleft Palate Clinic where they would take photographs, x-rays, all the rest of it. And I was a study case. And I was informed a few years ago by an ear, nose, and throat guy who it turned out was at my first surgery. He was an attending physician at my first surgery, told me that I was the first patient to receive the cleft palate surgery. And I also only recently found out where they got the cartilage to create a palate for me. I have a little notch out of either one of my ears near the top of the lobe. That's where they got the cartilage. I also still have a scar on my ankle after all these years from the blood transfusion given to me by my uncle while I was being operated on. So 7 operations later, the only one I remember is the last one, which was to basically give me a septum on the right-hand side of my face. That's the only operation I remember. That happened when I was 7. I was supposed to go in for a final operation when I was 16 to fix my upper lip, to remove some of the scar tissue. And I said, no, thank you. I will grow a mustache as soon as I can. As soon as I am able, I'm going to grow a mustache. And basically, that's what I did. Now, you know, these people saying that people sensitive about facial deformities and they don't want to be ridiculed and everything else. I had some of that. I sure did. I mean, I still got a nose that makes me look like I, was a prize fighter who didn't win a lot. And all the attending sinus problems and everything else that go along with it. But, I faced some problems in school. I had a scarred upper lip. After the operation to give me a septum, I had a scar on my nose worthy of Boris Karloff for a long time. And, it was not attractive. But I never let it bother me. And the main reason I never let it bother me is the support of my parents. My parents never made an issue out of it, never drew attention to it, never said, poor you, or anything like that. And so I never got a complex about having something that, kids can be cruel, something that kids could be cruel about. And because of my very persistent mom and my very supportive parents, I don't really have any issues with any of this. You know, so as a person with a who's lived their life with a disfigured face, with a scar, you know, a very prominent scar, I have, you know, I poo-poo these efforts on the part of these do-gooders to make a big deal out of the fact that James Bond villains might, you know, be missing an eye or have some scar tissue on their face. I think it's lunatic. I think it's silly. I think they ought to go do something else. You know, get a job. But they probably all work for non-government organizations and, you know, basically pad their resumes with this kind of intense caring that they do. So, if you're wondering about the mustache, yeah, I did grow one. And as you can see, I'm about maybe 24 here. It took a while. It took a while to get the mustache to cover up that area of scar tissue just below my nose. But you know, I grew up a well-adjusted kid. You know, and I think a well-adjusted adult. You be the judge. Hey, support good comics. And how do you do that? Because there's so many crappy comics out there. There's so many woke comics. There's so many comics with a political agenda or comics that are created to make you feel bad about yourself. And what do we want out of comics? We just want escapist entertainment. We just want a few moments to read something silly or exciting or intriguing to take our minds off of our everyday drudge of a life. And that's what comics do, and that's what comics are best at, and that's the history of comics. So you want to support good comics, and there's a lot of them out there. And you know where there's a lot of them? There's a lot of them at Archaven, at Arctoons for free digital service. I know most of you unauthorized listeners are very much aware of Archaven, are very much aware of Arctoons. What you may not be aware of, and what I have not reminded any of you of recently, is there is a Patreon account, Archaven. It is my Patreon account, but we're calling it Archaven because all the funds exclusively go to pay the artists for all of the Arctoon series that I am specifically creating for Arctoons. That's Something Big, Go Monster Go, My Sister Suprema, and the upcoming Ferocious. So, you know, if you want to give $1, $3, $5, it would help immensely. If, you know, because every contribution helps me, you know, basically pay these artists. And maybe someday I might even be able to pay myself. But right now that's not important to me. What's important to me is making sure these guys can put food on the table, because I got some fantastic talent working with me. You know, Frank Fosco and Anthony Gonzalez-Clark and Tim Latti, and we really want to, you know, keep going with this. And the response has been terrific. But to the site, we're creeping up on 3 million views, which is amazing, given that, you know, we really only started a few months ago, and but we could certainly use your support, and it means a lot. Every buck counts. Okay, that's it for me. I'll see all of you down the road. And there you have it, a few blasts from the past, some opinions and stories you may have heard before from me, but perhaps in a little bit more depth. So anyway, that's it for this week. Hand to God. New show next week. Dixon out.